Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks what atheists should be doing next in a godless world. Hello everyone, this is Nathan here with my co-host Todd Tavares.
Hey, that's me.
So Todd, apparently you have an amusing anecdote.
No,
No?
yes, of course I do.
Okay.
It's about wildlife,
Uh-huh.
Nathan. You're from the wilds of Canada. What's the
Yes.
wildlife like where you are? How often do you get to see animals?
Now and then, I saw some deer recently in someone's front yard, and that was pretty cool. Yeah, the place I live, there's some forested areas around, so I guess deer kind of occasionally come into people's yards,
See,
and I look forward to seeing more of them, I hope.
that totally changes my perception of Canada. I imagine you all have moose,
Mm,
treading the river in your front yard, or fording the river
yeah,
the valley stream near where you live. I guess Canada's a
hmm
little different than I expected.
yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, there's not many moose where I am anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. We don't actually. We do get a lot of deer. They're kind of
Okay.
treated like a nuisance.
Yeah.
So it's one of the things that I've definitely seen in my lifetime is like that deer have made a resurgence, and Canada geese. Your
Right.
geese, Nathan, your Canada
hmm
geese have just become like public enemy number one. They used to be a rare thing. Now they're everywhere. They're ubiquitous, and they're here all the time. And they leave disgusting green poop everywhere.
Yeah, they are a nuisance, and and also that yeah, like they can be quite aggressive, I guess, too. So that's another problem. Yeah.
And see, yeah, and I had urban animal spottings, I guess. You
Uh-huh.
know what I mean? Like when you think of urban animals, what do you think of?
I think of raccoons and possums and things like that.
Exactly right. Yeah, we had a possum in one of my neighbor's yards.
Uh-huh.
Because we have where I am, it's all like brownstones, and they have yards in the back,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm in the end spot, so I can kind of see all the yards. And one of them had just a dead possum lying in it,
Right.
just perfect, right? And then it was a question of like, great, how long is that going to be there? And it's because it's not bad when it's cold, but it's starting
Yes.
to get warm, and that's going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it was there. It was there for a while, and it's been there. But one day, I was so lucky. I'm so glad I caught this. There's a dude out doing some work on the house or in the yard, and he sees the possum, and I got so excited. But then this is what my brain did. This is where it went. It's like, wait a minute. What's he gonna do? What are
Right.
the odds that he just like goes up to it, pokes it with a stick, and then leaves again? There's
Yes.
no way. There's no way he would do that. So he stood around, he saw it, he walked over, he kind of looked at it, checked
Mm-hmm.
out the other angles, poked
Yeah.
it with a stick, and then went back to doing what he had been doing before. I was
Right.
like, no way. It's crazy. And then I started thinking, there's got to be a way. How do we work that into a metaphor? Is that like is there
mm-hmm.
an atheist tale in there where it's like, yeah,
Yeah, something about
that.
the social contract or something like that. I don't know. Or
Oh, I
or
was
like
thinking
the
the possum is like God, and we know he's
oh.
dead. Oh, but you're saying the social contract is dead, but we'll all just kind of pretend it isn't.
No, no, I was sort of thinking there's some ethical thing where it's it's not his responsibility to do it, but maybe it's like the ethical thing to do, like for him to do it to clean it up or
Mm-hmm.
something. I don't know. I don't know
Right?
really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. There might be a good moral question in there. Like you're
hmm
you're working in your yard, you find a dead possum. What do you do?
Yeah. Like, it's
Yeah.
not your job to do it, but it's someone needs to do it. It's like the tragedy of the commons or something like that. Well, no, that's a different thing, I guess. But
The tragedy of the backyard.
but
But
it's sort of like it's not clear whose problem such and such a thing is, and then it just gets worse and worse, and then someone needs to do it, but no one really wants to actually be the one to do it because then
oh,
I don't know, then maybe it sets a precedent, then they need to do this again every time or whatever. I don't know.
yeah, that's what all the other neighbors were thinking. Like, I hope he doesn't touch it because then I have to clear up all the dead possums in my yard. That's the big
How
problem.
many, how many like dead fossils are appearing in these
No,
yards?
it's just the one. It's just the one.
Yeah.
No, and I'm not blameless in this. I don't know my neighbors. I don't know the rules either. I wouldn't
Hmm.
if there were a dead possum in the backyard, I wouldn't know what to do.
Yeah.
But it's yeah, yeah.
Just yeah, you just leave it and just like hope
And
that
just hope it
nature
goes
does
away.
something to it. Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. Nature
Yeah.
gave it, nature will take it away.
Yes.
It, yeah, I imagine the metaphor being like, oh, it's
Mhm.
that possum is God, and you know what, Nathan,
Right.
I know it's dead. I know
Mhm.
God's gone, and suddenly my neighbor has to come to the realization that
Mm.
that's an ex God right there. And what does he do? He just
Right.
carries on. Changes, just
Uh,
decides that's not for him,
right.
right?
Hmm. That's true. Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, I can see how that could
Yeah.
work as a metaphor. Yeah.
Oh, let me tell you, Nathan. This metaphor is going to be huge. It's going to be blowing up
Okay.
in about
It's just
2 years.
gonna be.
Every atheist is going to be talking about the dead possum
Yeah. Right.
metaphor,
Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
right? But it's like people who are aware of the dead possum, people who are aware that God isn't real, right? And
Mm.
this is one of the things we've kind of been confronting recently, right? If we look back on all these podcasts we've done, so many, so we've learned so much. But there are aspects of it that are like this, right? Like if you have this knowledge, if this is what you know, and this is what your view is, what responsibilities and duties come with that? And
Mm.
we've been focusing on moving this forward, but we're gonna coming up. We'll talk to other historians who tell
Mhm.
us about the past, how things have happened in the past. And we happen to know, I happen to know pretty well, a historian.
Yes.
Yeah, who's written a wonderful book, right?
Yeah.
And his
That's
name
true.
is Nathan Alexander. Nathan, you're a historian about, or an historian who writes about atheism in the past, actions and behaviors,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
What can you tell us about if we go back in time, knowing what we know about atheists, agnostics, spiritual but not religious, people who are spiritual, seculars, is that something that existed in the past, that sort of division? Or,
Yeah, I
well,
think
what?
I think
Yeah.
well, I should say like first, like my own area of expertise is the 19th century, in Britain and the U.S. Mostly. I mean, I know I know a little bit about beyond that time too, but just like today, there are a range of sort of different kind of non-religious identities.
Mm,
So in the 19th century, you had people who were atheists and agnostics. Agnostic was a term that was coined in the 19th century, and you have another label would be freethinker, which
mm,
was kind of a more catch-all term for someone who's maybe not Christian, but they're they don't believe in God, or they're
mm,
or at least they're deist. That's another one, which is a deist is someone who believes God created the universe and maybe provided some moral framework for everyone, and then just sort of threw his hands back and let everything
mm,
unfold. And so in the deist worldview, there is a God, like there's a creator God, but the God doesn't intervene in any way in the world.
mm,
And so this means Jesus, for example, was not viewed as he was just a man in the deist view.
mm.
Mm.
So he's kind of like a clockmaker,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, God. Yes, exactly.
right?
Yeah, who sort of
Yeah,
sets the thing going and then just steps back and watches it sort of
yeah.
unfold.
And was agnostic? Did that take the same meaning? in the 19th century that it has now? This sort of like
Yeah.
unknowability of God or people who aren't certain. Was
hmm
it describing the same sort of group, describing the same ideas?
Yeah, I think so. So the term is coined by T.H. Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, I guess is
Mm,
sort of his nickname. Like he was a scientist in Britain in the in the mid and late 19th century. So Huxley coined the term agnostic as meaning literally like without knowledge. So his
mm,
argument was it wasn't knowable, I guess, whether God existed or not.
mm,
And I think he had this idea that agnosticism was sort of a method, I suppose, of thinking about questions about not just God, but any like it could be applied to many things, I suppose, where it's
mm,
like something is just by definition maybe unknowable. But I think, I mean, the interesting thing, like I wrote an article about that, and I can link it in the description. But about in the 19th century, like some atheists were kind of critical of agnostics because the atheists said basically agnostics didn't differ in any substantial way from atheists. It was just sort of window dressing to avoid some of the negative connotations
mm,
that came with being an atheist, because obviously in the 19th century being an atheist was quite an unpopular thing to be, and it was
mm.
really stigmatized in society and so on.
Oh yeah, well, we'll get to that.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
so
But anyway, I mean, so they were saying like these agnostics are just sort of middle class people who still want to move about polite society, but they
uh
don't want to be kind of associated with atheists. So they've just come up with this new label. I
how did
mean,
that work
yeah,
for deists and freethinkers? Because it's not like
yeah,
deists. That's I mean that's a very particular category, and we know that. I'm pretty sure some of the American founding fathers kind of
right, yeah,
slipped into that
hmm
category,
hmm
where they saw a creator at the beginning, but not an
yeah,
active one.
hmm
But freethinkers, to me, this one kind of stands out because it doesn't. I don't see the sort of parallel. Are these people who are freethinkers in the sense that they have opinions about their faith but disagree with their church, or are they people who think of things that are completely different than what the church provides?
I think it's the latter. Like I think freethinker was sort of a general kind of label for anyone sort of not within the framework, I suppose, of like Christianity or like
Mm.
another religion, I guess. Although really there weren't like Judaism or something like that. But then I guess Judaism, although that's a complicated thing because obviously there are many secular Jews as well, and then even in the 19th century too. So
Well,
yeah,
it's and those were in, I mean, much different societies, right? They didn't, I mean, they would not have been as diverse as they are now. And certainly
yeah,
not
hmm
for atheists too. I mean, the thing we've been talking about is we're now secular people are 20 to 24% of the population. Very different society at the time. What was the sort of social context that
yeah.
freethinkers, agnostics, deists, and atheists are dealing with in the 19th century U.S. and
Yeah.
Britain?
It's definitely like a very cultural and societal and even like political and legally dominated by
Mm,
Christianity. I mean, it's different in the US and Britain because, like, in Britain or in England anyway, like, there's the established Church of England. That's
mm,
sort of the state church. And in like the, British Parliament there, and it's still there's like there's seats reserved for bishops and
mm,
or in the House of Lords, I should say. And I mean, obviously, like the monarch is the head of the Church of England and also the head of state. And then like and also things like getting into Oxford or Cambridge, one needed to like profess their allegiance to I think it's 39 articles of like the Anglican Church, something like I think
oh
it's 39.
wow,
Yeah, so
wow.
I think it wasn't up until like the middle of the 19th century that this changes. I'm not sure exactly
Mm.
when.
So it's like it's really there's a link between the church and the state, pretty solid
Yeah,
link in
exactly.
the
Yeah.
UK between church
Yeah.
and state, and a lot of these other institutions. So
hmm
high society social institutions
hmm
demand religious adherence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it was again like in the early to mid 19th century when even like restrictions on Catholics and Jews were lifted.
Last week we were talking to Andrew Grosson of the
Hmm.
Secular Coalition, and he was in Ireland when they removed the blasphemy law in 2018. And one of the points he made is that, like, they had never even, no one had ever been prosecuted under it. I think one person had
Yeah.
been investigated
Yeah.
under it.
Hmm.
And I looked into it a little bit, and like, there hadn't been a blasphemy case in Ireland back to 1855.
Mm.
But I mean, that also means in the 19th century there were blasphemy cases. Were there
Yeah.
blasphemy laws? Were there persecution for being an atheist, being an open and avowed atheist in the UK in the
Yeah.
19th century?
Yeah. I'm not sure what the legal like wording was, but yeah, definitely people were arrested and sent to prison for professing atheist views. And many like prominent free thinkers like George Holyoake, who he's the one who coined the term secularism, like he was spent time in prison, I think a year in prison for blasphemy. Yeah, and like until the end of the 19th century, like another one who's named G.W. Foote, who published the magazine called the newspaper called the Freethinker in the late 19th century. He was also in prison, I think, for blasphemy or for publishing like his free thought newspaper, which had kind of like controversial cartoons. I'm not sure if that's exactly why he was in prison, but I mean, not for the cartoons. I'm not sure, but yeah. So definitely, in so many ways, like legal and institutional and sort of political and then just generally like social and cultural reasons why atheists and other non-religious people suffered in Britain.
Mm,
And in the US it's different because obviously there's the separation of church and state formally, I suppose, in the Constitution.
yes. Yeah.
But nonetheless, obviously there was still like considerable social and cultural pressure that stigmatized atheists and other non-religious people. But then there's also the case that there were no blasphemy laws, but some atheists or freethinkers were caught up in so-called obscenity laws and then were sent off to prison. So one example is D.M. Bennett, who published the newspaper The Truth Seeker. He was targeted like in the late 19th century for there were these laws called the Comstock laws put forward by this sort of puritanical guy called Anthony
Okay.
Comstock. Basically, he was like it was about you couldn't send like obscene material through the mail,
Okay.
and I think this guy had a real vendetta against DM Bennett for his non-religion, and I think it was even the case that Comstock had some way like tricked him or like there was definitely something shady about the whole thing,
It
obviously.
was a bit of entrapment
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
to
Um,
get that evil free
yeah.
thinker.
Just the point in general is that even though there was no specific blasphemy law as in Britain, nonetheless, like
Hmm.
you could still face legal punishment for your non-belief, even if it was sort of in a more roundabout way.
Right. So it sounds like the UK and the US, they didn't have formal laws that said you had to belong in this religion, you have to
Mm,
perform these particular duties, but there's a lot of the cultural, societal, institutional pressure to do that, and even some formal restrictions on openly espousing or proclaiming atheist ideas.
mhm,
That's pretty rough. How many, and like you were saying, like if you can't get into Oxford, you're going to be excluded. There's a lot of
mm,
social sanction and
mhm.
exclusion. How is there an idea of how many atheists and others? Let's just lump them all together as
Yeah.
secular atheists, just a generic atheist,
Mm.
unbelievers. Is there an idea of how many there were in society at the time?
That's a really good question. And it's really hard to know the answer. The interesting thing is that it's just sort of come into attention recently, I guess, just because the UK is doing a census, I guess, this year.
Mm,
And I was just reading a thread on Twitter about it, and I can link that in the description as well. But it was
hmm
talking about this. I guess it was the first census in 1851, and they were looking at in Britain, and they were looking at church going, and they found that like half of the people weren't in church on this given Sunday. And I guess this caused like quite a sensation
Mhm.
because it's like one wonders like how many, what that means exactly to have, when you're supposedly such a religious country, to have like half the population not in church. And even it
Yeah,
was even worse
totally.
among like, or I mean, or better depending on your
Yeah.
perspective, but
Mhm.
among the urban populations, where it was like the situation was really dire, because it was, I'm not sure the numbers, but just like very few people, I guess, attending church among like urban, like the workers basically. And so there was
Yeah.
quite a concern about like these are unconscious secularists, I guess was the word. So it's like,
Mm.
these people, maybe they're not atheist or something, but they're in some ways maybe outside the confines of the church.
Yeah, right. And I mean, this may have like a parallel to today. This
mm,
idea of, like sure, everybody on paper, everybody belongs to a religion. In 1850 or whenever, everybody belongs to a religion. Everybody's a member of a church.
mm,
We're all devout, pious
mm,
people, but the reality is, only 50% are going to church. And of those, who knows how many actually believe? The difference then is that it's just that how many are able to express it outwardly,
mm,
and that sounds like in the 1850s it's a lot fewer. It's far smaller number, although completely unknowable. Of
yeah,
those who were openly and avowedly irreligious, I mean, we
yeah,
can't even use secular because it didn't completely
mm,
exist then.
mm.
What values did they espouse? Can you look at them and say, okay, this is clearly an atheist belief from a particular free thinker? Or are there a set of values that they espouse, or are they fairly eclectic?
I think one of the values is, I guess, eclecticism, I suppose, if that's a
Hmm.
word. I think with regard to politics, I think
Or just social
just,
values?
yeah, I guess they were like liberal, like small L, that
Mm. Hmm.
there was greater sort of freedom for example, like matters of gender roles maybe, or even something like sexuality. I mean, I don't think like, probably not, what we would think, but there were people who were, I guess, were more open about different kinds of relationship structures. Like there are people who talked about free love, and which
Mm.
was
Mm.
not be like sort of a monogamous relationships necessarily. So, but then I mean that was sort of controversial in the movement, but nonetheless, I think there were definitely more liberty kind of granted in those cases, and people were generally more open and tolerant of
Mm.
different ways of living. Go,
Yeah. Do you know if there's much overlap with what we would think of as the birth of liberalism? So I think at
yeah,
that time you'd have Mill, I
yeah,
think is
yeah,
about,
hmm, hmm,
and the utilitarians,
yeah,
who are like Bentham,
yeah.
definitely a liberal, not a I'm not sure where he would stand on religion though.
I think, but
Was there
yeah,
an overlap between this movement of utilitarians and liberals and free thinkers?
yeah, definitely. I think I'm not sure about like what Bentham's actually his religious views are, but definitely like John Stuart Mill was
Mm,
a unbeliever, even if he expressed some sympathy for sort of the social utility of religion.
mm,
Like it has a value in, bringing a community together, things like that. And he was
mm,
interested in this idea of like a religion of humanity, but nonetheless, like he's basically a non-believer. And yeah, I think there's definitely like a pretty clear link between the ideas of Mill, like the liberal ideas about, say, like extending the vote to all
mm.
people, like all adults, even women,
Even women,
even women. Yes,
even women.
yeah, like so. Yeah, John Stuart Mill, like he was an MP in the middle of the 19th century, and he was the first one to propose granting suffrage to women, although it
Mm,
wasn't successful at the time. But yeah, I think the in Britain anyway, like Mill and that's whole school of like liberal thought was, well, they were called radicals at the time. That was sort of formed, I think, the program for many free thinkers, like the political program. But then you also have, and generally like it's also about reducing like the power of religion in the state as well, and like
Mm.
granting greater freedom of speech and so on. But
Really?
then, yeah, but then you also have like a sort of a socialist aspect as well in the 19th century, and that's another strain of thought within the free thought movement as
Mm.
well.
So not so much that there's a particular. I mean, I think this is something that we've recognized today, that there isn't. There are a lot of commonalities and overlap,
Hmm.
but there's not one particular type of atheist. There's not one set value system or set of political aspirations. But it sounds like they did have some success changing things socially. Were they
Hmm.
able to progress? And I'm loath to use that word, but were
Yeah.
they able to begin a process of secularization and to create things that further separated church and state?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just thinking like one example is Charles Bradlaugh, who was
Hmm.
he founded the National Secular Society in Britain, and he was also an MP in the later 19th century. He was the first sort of openly atheist member of parliament. But there was such a controversy over him like taking his seat because
Hmm.
you have to swear an oath and you say something like "So help me God." I think I'm not sure what the oath is. I think it's that.
Hmm.
And so obviously he wasn't going to swear that because he didn't believe it. And so then like there was a big controversy. Like he was not able to take his seat. And so like he was kicked out of the parliament, and then like he had to be elected again, and this and then
Really?
he
Because
refused to take the oath, and then like again he was rejected from the parliament and so on. So
wow.
it went on for about like 6 years before he was like it was like a big legal battle as well.
Over saying the magic words.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And
And
so, yeah,
how was it resolved? Did he say it or did they change it?
they, I think they allowed him well, the thing was he wanted to affirm, which is, I guess, is different than saying an oath. And I think it's like
Mm,
what maybe other religious people did who didn't believe in saying an oath. They
okay.
affirmed. But then like soon after he took his seat, I believe they passed some kind of motion or whatever in parliament or act or something to get rid of that requirement. So that's a small
Yeah.
example, but
Mm. But it's interesting because you can see in it, it has the way you have this one dominant way, right? This is our particular church way to do it, and how
mhm,
you make an accommodation for other religious people, for the religious other. And then it's an even bigger hurdle once you try to break out of the idea
mhm,
of how you need a religion to do that thing. But then once it goes away, I guess this is the story of secularism, right? It's we need religion to do this. If we don't do it the religious way, everything falls apart. And then you do it without religion and everything's fine.
right, yes, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And it sounds like that's the story that's happening. Do you see, when you look back as an historian, when you reflect now on where things are today, do you see this as a continuous history with links in a chain, or is it something different, like I don't know, like a punctuated equilibrium, or a
Mm.
battle that starts anew every 10 or 20 years?
I think there is a connection, definitely, in terms of like atheists and secular people. There's definitely historical linkage between atheists today and those in the 19th century or even before. And I think it's like the same kind of issues animate atheists and other people now as did in the 19th century. Like, and I think another thing is that, as sort of a general observation, I guess, is that many atheists in the past like were sort of ahead of their times, I suppose, like in terms of like for example like John Stuart Mill, and
Yeah.
the question of like women voting. I mean, I think
Mm,
atheists generally are a little bit ahead of their time politically in
mm,
all sorts of ways. And I think that's maybe just like a could be a feature of being willing to like to question, because obviously if they're atheists or non-religious, like they've questioned one particular thing that's taken for granted in their society, which is
yeah.
like God's existence. So that means they might be more willing in general to question any other kinds of like taboos about people who say, well, it's just the way we've always done things, that women don't vote, and then they're more willing to maybe question those things that are just taken on faith, I guess.
Right? Yeah, I see why they got lumped in. There are were called radicals if you're being that transgressive.
Hmm.
And I guess that's it sounds like that's a lot of where this existed, right? It's not on the they're not in the middle of society. They're not the establishment. It's
Hmm.
people who are definitely
Yeah.
it's from the sound of it back then taking a tremendous risk, right? Where
Yeah.
even if you're elected to parliament, you can lose your jobs
Hmm.
because you don't have the appropriate religious belief.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty dangerous. But also, I mean, that we do, and I think we've mentioned this before, but just our existence is kind of a threat.
Mm.
It's, like if you
Hmm.
are living as a good, if you're a good example, right?
Hmm.
Kind of person who lives their life without God and everything's fine and dandy. That can be a threat, right? Or people with a very fragile system of faith.
Yeah.
It can really shake it.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's true.
mm.
Yeah.
I
That's
mean,
yeah.
there's so much rich stuff in there because it also makes me wonder, like, if once you know that 50% of the population doesn't go to church, you might be less afraid to say, well, I don't really believe in all that. If you know
Yeah.
that most people, flip a coin, they're not going to be disturbed one way or the other.
Yeah.
Um,
That's true. The only thing just to say about the 50% not going to church, I mean, it could also be that maybe they were. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're secular. I mean, they could have been just taking a week off, or they might do a different kind of religious kind of thing, like some Bible study or something that wasn't counted. But
mm.
yeah, but I mean, I think it is true, like that. Yeah, I think it's like sort of strength in numbers, that once other people have come out and said, maybe I don't believe in this, then other people feel more confident to say the same thing.
But one thing that I notice, I mean, just thinking back or making a quickly comparing and contrasting, that those categories that you talked about before, free thinker, agnostic, deist, and atheist, we still have atheists. We still have
Right.
agnostics. What happened with free thinkers and deists?
That's a good.
Do
Yeah.
we know what happened there?
I think the thing about free thinker is, like, as a label, is that, and I think in general, like non-religious labels, like it's often that more than one might apply to someone. So
Mm,
someone who's a free thinker could also say they're an atheist. I really don't know why that category declined, because I would say in the 19th century, like that was the main label that people used. Like, just sort of my general impression that that was what they called themselves,
mm.
even though some did say atheists. But I don't know what
Is
happened
it
to that
just the
category.
label? It might then just be the title.
Yeah, I think maybe in Juham's, one of his surveys, like he was looking at potential, like, labels that people use, and I think freethinker was one of them.
Mm.
But it's not as common now, and I'm not sure why. I mean, another thing is, like, humanist is another word that comes around in the 20th century, that maybe that gained some popularity, and people move to that. But with DS is another one. Like, that's true. Like, really, no one's a DS now, I guess. I mean,
Yeah.
or maybe they are, but they there's no, like, organized deists or anything like that, or it's not
Oh,
a
that's too
it's
bad.
not a common
Okay.
label, I don't think. I don't
Oh,
know
well,
why.
we'll have to
Yeah,
check. There's got to be a
yeah,
podcast like
yeah,
drinking with the deists,
yeah.
which I guess every week it'd be the same. It's like, yeah,
Right.
we'd like to thank the creator for inventing barley and hops and water,
Yeah.
but you're not here anymore, so it doesn't matter.
Yes. Yeah, right. Well, I mean, that's the sort of the funny thing, I guess, is like, if you're a DS, like, obviously you're not praying, because what's the point, right? So,
Right? Yeah.
yeah, I think it's possible that DS maybe get folded into just Christianity, like, as secularization progresses, because maybe the numbers of, like, atheists and agnostics and so on, like, get bigger and bigger, that maybe deists, because they believe in a god, they nonetheless kind of just get folded into Christianity. which
Yeah, I suppose that could be something that it's sort of spiritual but not religious. Yeah.
that's true. That's true. But I think I'm not sure, but I think spiritual but not religious people might give a greater like sort of interventionist role for some kind of spiritual thing in the world. Although I mean there are people who talk about, they don't believe in Christianity, but they think there's a higher power or something like that. And I think that's probably
Right.
fairly close to deism. Like there's just something that explains why there's a universe and so on.
But that I mean this is a great one for the secular community survey.
Mm,
That hopefully that'll be able to answer it. So maybe if there are deists out there, they can take that and do that,
yeah,
which is still I think the secular communities survey
yeah.
is ongoing.
I think
So
it's
we'll
until
link to that.
yeah, middle of April, I think.
Yeah.
But
Oh
it
yeah, that's
yeah,
so that it'll be up for a while.
yeah,
And when that's done, we that's definitely something we have to ask about.
yeah, yeah.
That would be wild.
Um,
Yeah, how
but
many
just go
deists there
yeah,
are.
just going back to the DS point. um, it is true, like you mentioned, like I think many founding fathers in the U.S. were deists, and like Thomas Paine is a famous
Mm,
famous one. So I mean, it's like it's quite a noble tradition, I suppose, like deism, and I think it's like many deist arguments from the 17th and 18th century. I guess they were arguments against the Bible and saying that it's just another book, and it's because
yeah.
obviously it's not divinely inspired if God isn't intervening in the world. So many of these like arguments against the Bible were then kind of taken up later on by atheists. So there's sort of a pretty direct link between the deism of earlier centuries and then sort of full blown atheism in the 19th century.
Yeah, yeah. There is so one of the deists that's pretty famous is Thomas Jefferson. And he took it so far as to edit his own Bible
Yes, right.
to make it yeah, removed all the miracles because
Hmm.
he's like this is clearly nonsense.
Yeah.
Jesus has got some cool stuff. Let's keep that. Let's
Hmm.
just get rid of all this
Hmm.
miracle nonsense.
Hmm.
He was also a big supporter of the division of church and state.
Hmm.
And I think if you're ever in DC, I've got to double check on this one. The Jefferson Memorial above him in the rotunda, so above his statue, there's a quote about like how he would never kneel to tyranny, and it's actually about religious authority and like never submitting to religious authority. And like putting all this together, this sounds strongly atheistic, more than more than just something particularly deist.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's I think historically it's interesting the categories that persist and remain nearly identical, whereas the ones that seem to fluctuate over time, or maybe they're almost like filler. It's something that I mean, hopefully the secular community survey will tell us a little bit more about this part. I mean, this is probably the same area. I think today we would call them either secular or spiritual, but not religious.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting, the whole issue of like what people call themselves. And another, like the modern one is like this issue of being a bright,
Mm,
which is like a coinage, I think, in maybe in the early 2000s by, I think it's Daniel Dennett who came up with it, just as like a more positive way to be like a non-religious person. I mean, that was the idea anyway, but I don't know if
yeah,
it really caught on very much. Although I think if I remember right, like in Juam's survey, I think there was like a question about that, and I think Bright, like some people did click check that as like one of their identities that they kind of accepted.
really.
Yeah,
I think they are lightly organized, is how I
could
would
be.
describe it.
Yeah,
I think they still have communities.
yeah, could be.
Which is something like, I mean, unless there is a drinking with deist group that I don't know about. I don't know of freethinker communities, which seems to be one of those sort of like lost historical connections.
That is
What
true.
you
Yeah,
think?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Whereas we know, like, so if we move, I think you mentioned this about the 20th century, um, ideas of secularism and humanism. those develop later?
Well, the secularism, that's coined in the 19th century, and like by George Holyoake, who I mentioned,
Mm,
and he he meant it, I suppose, more as like a, rather than, I guess today we might say secularism is about like the separation of church and state, and he definitely obviously thought that, but for him it was also like a more positive worldview. Like it wasn't, the reason he came up with this idea of secularism is he thought atheism was sort of a purely a negative thing, like it's just saying what you don't believe in. But for him, like secularism was
mm,
about creating like a more positive worldview.
mm,
And that's so, and then like the National Secular Society is founded in Britain and like soon afterwards. But I think that meaning is also somewhat gone away a little bit, even though like there are people who are secular now. But I think we don't necessarily, we still sort of think of secular as more of like a negative in the terms of it's like it's non-religious rather than being
yeah.
like a positive worldview. But I
But
think
it's not. It talks about things you can't do rather than things you can
yes,
do or
right,
that you
right,
should believe.
hmm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. But it also seems that that the sort of secular and humanist side did more institution building, where we don't see much of that with freethinkers and deists.
Well, what do you like? What do you mean? Like coming up with like
Not just
organizations,
coming
or
up with terminology,
mm,
coming up with either more defined programs or literal organizations.
I'm not sure. Just because I think that in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, I think there's such an overlap between like even saying like deists and freethinkers and secularists. Like I think these are all pretty similar people. Like so,
Mm-mm.
it is interesting though. I guess like what label is put on organizations, and it's true, I suppose, that today probably the organizations that are maybe the largest and most powerful are like humanist organizations, and then like last
Mm.
week Secular Coalition for America, for example. And in Britain there's the National Secular Society as well. So it is interesting like that, for whatever reason, like there's American Atheists, there's another organization, but
Yeah.
secular humanism does seem to be like more, for whatever reason, more of a, more commonly has a institutions sort of behind them, even though I mean
Mm.
obviously, yeah, atheists join these organizations and so on. And
But it's a historical development, right?
hmm,
It's changes over time, and we see that these are terms that are developed,
yeah,
agnostic,
yeah,
secular, and humanist, only in the last. I mean, so we're talking about the last 150,
yeah,
170 years or so.
yeah, right.
Would an atheist in 2021 recognize the similarity with an atheist from 1850? Do you think?
Yeah, definitely, I think so.
I
Yeah,
mean, the
yeah,
basic belief, oh, God's not real.
yeah,
Yeah, you definitely that. But are there persistent characteristics?
I think so. I mean, I feel like atheists in the 19th century and like free thinkers in general, like are, and also I think like, yeah, these people in the 19th century would recognize people in the 21st century as like,
Mm,
as fellow atheists as well. And they might, maybe they would say, you know, maybe our political views are a bit more radical than they would like, maybe, but nonetheless they would definitely recognize like that there is a common spirit, I suppose.
right.
And one, just just to go a little bit more, like I've looked at some of the ways that atheists in the 19th century like have told their own history. Like in the 19th century, there were many people writing books about like the history of free thought, and they were also kind of constructing an intellectual lineage for themselves that went back, say, to the, like to the Renaissance, or maybe to ancient Greece or in ancient
Of
Rome.
course.
But
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I don't think it's like illegitimate. I mean, I think it's true that like there's definitely some kind of linkage there, like a historical linkage. So I
Yeah.
think
So
they would see it's like a continuation of the same story. Like there was no kind of break between then and the present. So
yeah, we're not completely different animals. The way
no,
if you look at party history.
Yeah,
I
right.
mean, like the way the Labor Party of 2020 doesn't look anything like the Labor Party of
Right.
the 1970s, right? The Democrats of the 1880s would be aghast.
Yeah.
Actually, right, of the by the
Yes, and
Democrats of the 2020s,
yeah, that's right.
right?
Yes.
Yeah. So were they like they very have a very fluid belief system? Atheism seems pretty straightforward, and of course, I mean, it is a pretty straightforward belief system. This really, in the name, there's just one thing that's got to go.
Yeah.
That's
It's
all that we're
yeah.
focused on.
It is interesting though because like from that sort of narrow question about whether God exists, then all sorts of things flow from that, and I think there are commonalities again, like just on the question, for example, of like slavery. I think it seemed like in the 19th century, atheists were more active. I suppose like it's hard to say, obviously, but like sort of disproportionately
Yeah,
active in abolition movements. So I think there's like, even though it's a narrow question that they are basing their particular worldview on, nonetheless, there are all sorts of consequences from that.
yeah. Which is that slavery. I mean, that leads to an entirely different discussion, which is something I think you and I would have to come back to, because I think there's a book about this. Not sure if I could find it. I think the author's Nathan G.
Yeah,
Alexander,
yeah,
but like this idea of like anti-slavery, racial equality, gender equality,
hmm,
that are it's we don't know which way the causation goes, but they're tightly
yeah,
linked,
yeah,
right,
yeah,
between atheism and these equality movements.
hmm,
And that's something that I think I expect we would find in our community,
yeah,
and would
definitely,
make up our
yeah,
community,
yeah,
certainly.
hmm, yeah,
Which is great, and it's not something we haven't reflected on this, but I know that some of the people that we hope to speak to in the future or other historians looking at other social changes, looking at freethinkers, atheists, and agnostics, the secularization process, and more radical movements to abolish religion in countries.
hmm,
Um, that we are, it's strange to have both of these ideas in our head because I mean, personally, I come from a religious background. I come from a religious family. I come from a family that was Catholic since forever, since as far as
hmm,
we know.
hmm,
So in the personal sense, there's a complete break, and I'm sure this is
yeah,
true for a lot of other people.
mm, hmm,
But on the other hand, we're also part of an intellectual tradition that has a history,
hmm,
that has a pretty rich history, that has one that we actually fit into pretty well.
hmm.
And that's something I don't think we've considered
That's true.
heretofore.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
All
That
right.
there is like it's a highly personal thing, I suppose, but then it's like you make it within a particular social and historical context, I guess. And then you once you've made that that break, then you realize that there's a whole sort of other community in the present day and in the past. And I guess
Yeah.
it's interesting too, like the sort of contrast with the 19th century where it would definitely be possible where it's like, you could be living in a small community and you would be completely alone as a non-believer. And I mean, I think that's still true, but at least now one can connect through the internet and things like that. So, um,
Yeah. That's true.
mm,
It's a great point.
yeah.
Well, yeah. Anything else we should take away from this work?
I mean, I guess the thing that I'm interested in sort of exploring more in the podcast is like, is the issue about values and worldview and politics and things like that comes from atheism and non-belief.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I look forward to that as well. Like how does it shape our values and politics? What ought it be? Both the descriptive stuff, which I know we've dug into, and people have a chance to help us understand better through
Hmm.
things like this secular community survey, and to something more prescriptive, right? Like what
Yeah,
ought it be?
yeah, right.
Yeah. And it's great because we're defining it every day just by being ourselves
Mm,
and speaking honestly,
that's true.
and not letting others, speak for us,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
has been great.
Hmm.
Nathan, this is wonderful.
Yeah,
We should, yeah,
we should
should,
do this.
yeah, we should do this again
Yeah,
sometime. You and I
yeah,
chatting,
yeah,
having a
definitely.
conversation. That'd be amazing. Let's see. I don't know. Do you have anything that you need
No,
to to
just
get out into the world this week?
no, just follow me on Twitter.
Yeah, yeah.
Please.
What's the yeah, and what's the
Yeah,
I
it's
can't even think of it.
at
I don't even know
it's
what
a
they're called,
Twitter
Nathan.
Twitter handle, I believe.
What's your
At at
what's your code name,
yeah,
Nathan? What's your Twitter code name?
at Nathan G Alexander.
All right,
And
fantastic.
you want to
And I'm not on Twitter.
no,
I'm on Facebook. I exist there as a photo. It's mostly a ghost
yeah,
at this point. But yeah, I'm there. Check that out. There'll be other stuff in the links below. Um, Big thanks to Red Japan for the music. Amazing as
yes.
always.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, like literally they play the same song every
Every week.
yeah, it
E-
seems like we should just get them to record it, but no,
Perfectly every week,
yeah,
note for note.
yeah. Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
Love it.
It's
And
really
the fade in and out.
really inefficient way
How
to do
you
it,
do it.
but yeah.
But you got to do it.
I don't know any other alternative, but yeah.
No, I mean, you're not going to pay royalties. Come on.
No,
Yeah.
no, no.
Um,
But we should encourage people to like and subscribe and follow the
yes.
podcast. If
Like, subscribe, ring the bell, pull the
yes,
string, do whatever you got to do.
yeah,
Um, yeah, that's it for
yeah.
now.
All right. So I
Yeah,
guess
and come back next week. That's the other
yes,
thing. Yeah,
yes.
keep listening.